Thank you so much, Kusumji, for rendering the music. As Dr. Dash called out, today is recognized as the Nonviolence Day in the state of Minnesota. So to announce that, I call upon Srini Checker, who was our previous year's president and is currently leading our Government Relations Committee for IAM, to read out the proclamation of Nonviolence Day recognized in the state of Minnesota and signed by Governor Tim Walz. And I also call upon Kiran Bandi and Suyash and Pranesh.
Thank you, Srividya. A proclamation is a document issued by the governor to commemorate a specific time period to recognize, appreciate, and create awareness to a noteworthy cause, event, impact, or celebration. Happy to report that our Minnesota Governor, Tim Walz, issued a proclamation recognizing October 2nd as Nonviolence Day. I am now going to read the full text of the proclamation. Whereas October 2nd, 2021 is the 152nd anniversary of the birth of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, better known as Mahatma, the great soul, Gandhi, and the cardinal principle that guided Mahatma Gandhi was ahimsa or non-violence, and whereas his life and teachings have inspired leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and many others throughout the world, and whereas ahimsa calls upon individuals to refrain from hurting or injuring anyone through action, speech, or even thoughts, and promotes the fundamental belief that everyone should be treated with love, empathy, compassion, and respect, and ahimsa supports resolving disputes through nonviolent methods, and an awareness of nonviolent principles and practices is a powerful way to heal, transform, and empower our lives and communities, to recognize the dignity of every human being, and to promote peace and harmony among all people. And whereas the United Nations General Assembly has passed a resolution which declared October 2nd as International Day of Nonviolence, the resolution reaffirms the universal relevance of the principle of nonviolence and the desire to secure a culture of peace, tolerance, understanding, and nonviolence. Now, therefore, I, Tim Walz, Governor of Minnesota, do hereby proclaim Saturday, October 2nd, 2021 as Nonviolence Day. We are grateful to the Governor for issuance of this proclamation. I now call upon Kiran Bandi to receive the proclamation. Just one other quick call out. Today is also the birthday of Lal Bahadur Shastri, who was the second Prime Minister of India and a close associate of Mahatma Gandhi. In closing, I just want to call out that we should all strive to promote the Gandhian principles of nonviolence for effective social change and to help promote racial equity in the state of Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Srini. Next, we will be presenting a slideshow on Mahatma Gandhi. This is brought to us by Dr. Rajan. Dr. Rajan is an environmental engineer with over 35 years of experience with water stewardship, greenhouse gas mitigation, and climate change adaptation in the private sector. He is currently an independent environmental consultant and serves on many non-profit boards in Minnesota. He was appointed by the governor as the statewide business representative on the Clean Water Council in 2015. Dr. Rajan has been telling the story of Mahatma Gandhi's life, ideas and ideals through philately, his collection of postage stamps for over 25 years. I hope all of you had a chance to look at them out there in the exhibit area. Today the movie or slideshow that is going to be presented to you is to mark the centenary of the first large-scale civil disobedience movement called for by Mahatma Gandhi in India to boycott the royal visit of the Prince of Wales. The movie takes you through the historic journey, lessons learned from which are relevant to the non-violence community efforts even today. Dr. Rajan?
Thank you very much. Until the lion learns to tell his side of the story, tales of hunts will always glorify the hunter. This is not just an African proverb. This was part of amazing writings by Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian author. At the risk of sounding blasphemous, this is after all the Minnesota History Society, History Center, I would say that it is also the history of most written history. The context of African writing in particular is very relevant here because, as Nelson Mandela said to Indians, you gave us Mohandas and we returned him to you as the Mahatma. I've spent the last 30 years trying to bring history to life, particularly in the context of Mahatma Gandhi and his life and legacy. And today, I want to try and bring a 100-year-old story to life. Join me in this really brisk walk as I take you through this journey. If you can turn on the projector. So this was the Prince of Wales, who later became King George VIII for a very brief period, and his much promoted royal visit to India between November 1921 and March 1922. I presented this as a philatelic exhibit last month in Seattle at an exhibition. Mahatma Gandhi was inspired, ironically, by the writings of Henry David Thoreau back in 1849 about the duty of civil disobedience when he was arrested and thrown in jail in Concord, Massachusetts for being a tax resister against the Mexican War. And Gandhi organized this large-scale boycott of the royal visit. The lessons learned from this series of events that have unfolded over the next few months shaped the rest of India's nonviolent civil disobedience movement and later inspired Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and his civil rights movement here in the US. The royal visit started in Bombay and ended in Karachi in Sindh. And there were two stories, the story of the royals and the story of the people and the protest. And what I want to do here is to intertwine those two stories, those two worlds. One, the world of the powerful, and the other, the world of the powerless. And I'm going to do it through postal history because it was written when the event happened. A few months before the prince arrived, Gandhi wrote this. Take a look. He was not personally attacking the Prince of Wales in any way, but he was attacking what he represented. And he wanted Indians to challenge him publicly. And the way I traced this journey was postmarks. There were 5 different postmarks that the royal entourage used on the entire trip in every town that the prince stayed in. The postmark carried as what they refer to as the heraldic badge, the plume of 3 ostrich feathers, and his name. And they were used in every town he stayed in, but the towns were not mentioned. I had to go dig through his itinerary to figure out where it was written. And I'm going to walk you through those places and what happened there. So Gandhi wrote that he would welcome the prince personally, but it was his duty to boycott the bureaucracy that he represented. And a few months before, the prince arrived in India, the Indian National Congress actually passed a resolution saying that every Indians had to refrain from participating in or assisting in anything to do with the royal visit. That, of course, did not happen with every Indian, as we will see. The day the prince arrived in Bombay, Gandhi wrote, "As an armed cooperator, I neither own nor disown King George, but I have to dissociate from the system." This was the beauty of the movement. He wanted to lead, not something that was against people, but that was against systems that were oppressive. So the prince arrives in Bombay. When he arrived in Bombay, he was greeted with empty streets. But there were many Parsis, Anglo-Indians, and Goan Christian community members who, in Western attire, showed up to actually greet the prince. Riots broke out, led to property damage and even deaths. 2 days later, Gandhi launched his first hunger strike to bring the communal riots in Bombay to an end. And then the prince, in the meantime, went to Pune, basically a one-day visit to placate the Marathas, who the East India Company, if you recall, had crushed in 1819. Maratha Empire was completely subjugated by the English East India Company over 100 years before this. And the prince, ironically, goes out and lays a wreath at the foundation stone, a memorial to Chhatrapati Shivaji in Pune. A week after the Bombay riots, Gandhi wrote this, and the last sentence is what I will draw your attention to. "Swaraj does not lie in the way of violence. India does not want Bolshevism." So he repeatedly talked about Sinn Féinism and Bolshevism because it was very ripe in the minds of people at that time in international politics. And he specifically said, independence is not the priority. How we arrive there is my priority. But the prince, meanwhile, found friends elsewhere. He visited princely states. The first state he visited was Baroda. He was received by the Gaikwad. And I know with some people, even today, after all these years, after over 100 years, saying anything about the royal families in specific parts of India, some people take offense. But this was the reality of the history. He was treated lavishly. People were brought to the streets to basically showcase their loyalty to the crown. And children and shops and everything covered with flags, the Union Jack, were spread everywhere. And then from Baroda, he went to Udaipur. In Udaipur, the prince was guarded by feudal chiefs of all parts of Mewar, and their followers sitting mounted and armed in Arabian horses with matchlocks inlaid with gold and silver, held stiffly upright, and all the pomp and circumstance that goes with royalty. Nothing to do with what was happening on the ground to the people. This is a letter actually written by one of the photographers. There was only one prominent Indian photographer who took pictures of the royal entourage. The rest of them were all Western photographers. But so this letter was written by, and you can see these postmarks, they're all, by the date you can tell where they were mailed from. The prince found an old friend in Jodhpur, which is the Prince Maharaja Regent, Pratap Singh, Sir Pratap Singh, he was knighted, fought with him in World War I, alongside him, and set aside gilded gold thrones for the prince to come and sit under a shamiana, where he would be treated with presents, silk and gold and silver and everything else. From there he went to Bikaner. The royal train called through the desert, and every time the prince looked out of the moonlit window, he saw a lonely figure of sentinels sitting in camels, facing away from the train. They sat there rigidly on their camels, 200 yards away from the train tracks, every man holding aloft a fire when the train went by to let the next guy know that the prince is coming. He spent 5 days in Bikaner, and most of it was sports, which in the royal language means hunting, and often hunting alpha predators. The last princely state he visited was Bharatpur. He played polo, and then he was pleasantly surprised when his host, the Prince of Bharatpur, showed up in a golf cart pulled by 8 elephants. So the boycott organized by the Indian National Congress was most effective in the United Provinces and Bengal. Mass arrests were made all over December. And Jawaharlal Nehru and his father Motilal Nehru were arrested in Allahabad just a few days before the prince arrived. And this was one of several arrests for Jawaharlal Nehru between 1921 and India's independence. And of course, he went on to become the first Prime Minister of independent India. From there, the prince went to Nepal. In Nepal, it was not just this Prince of Wales, but the previous Prince of Wales in 1905, and the previous Prince of Wales in 1875, and it was the best place for them to go hunting tigers and rhinos. And the king of Kathmandu arranged for him to basically lure the tigers literally within a few hundred yards of the train station near the British India border, so that as soon as the prince got off the train, he could go and get his first tiger. And they were very proud of the pictures that they took. In Patna, the prince traveled